Hi, Future Frank here with a quick introduction to this photography course. Now you're currently at module number 1 and there are 8 modules. So my recommendation would be to subscribe and to click the bell icon to be notified of future uploads, and then you can sort of follow the modules as they've been uploaded. Or if you're watching in the future, they're already there, and all you need to do again is subscribe or just search for the each video. And what I'm going to do is make the thumbnails consistent, just numbered different, and of course each will have its own individual title telling you what the content's going to be. It's all very easy. I'm teaching you how to use YouTube. You already know that. Now I'm sure you're going to love the class. I've got thousands of students worldwide, and my classes were massively popular when I used to run full classes. I don't do that anymore, and hence that's why I'm putting my class on YouTube, because I do loads of other things. You don't need to do that, but I do loads of other things. So I've been teaching photography for 15 years, and if you want to see any nice feedback or read a bit more about me, it's all out there on the internet. Okay, I'll hand you over to the other Frank, and I really do hope you enjoy the class, and thanks for joining in. Okay, cheers. Photography is all about exposure, but what is exposure? Well, a camera is basically a black box that has a sensor inside that we expose to light when we take a photograph. Now, before digital, of course, this would have been a light-sensitive roll of film. Now, to capture the perfect photograph, we simply need to control the light entering the camera. So in this module, we will take a look at the 3 elements that we use to determine the exposure, and they would be aperture size, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, understand these 3 elements and you're on your way to mastering photography. So essentially, you are just 3 steps away from perfect photographs. Now, is it that simple? Well, I think it is. So let's take a look at where those 3 elements are inside your camera. So I'm going to use this animation of a typical mirrorless camera to show you whereabouts the 3 exposure elements are inside the camera. So first of all then, the light will pass into the camera through the lens on the front. Now essentially a lens is just a hollow tube, but we have the ability to make the internal diameter of this lens or this hollow tube bigger or smaller, and of course that is going to affect the exposure. It's going to affect the amount of light that enters into the camera. So let's have a look at how that works then. As you can see, we can affect the internal diameter by closing down the aperture blades. Now clearly, if you make the aperture size inside this lens smaller, less light will enter the camera, and the bigger the size, more light will enter the camera. Now aperture is just a fancy word for hole. So you can make the hole inside this lens bigger or smaller. Now of course that affects the exposure, like I say, but also its creative use is to determine how much of your photograph is in focus. And this is really great when we start to get creative with the camera, but more on aperture size later. All you need to know at the moment is that aperture size is one of the elements that we use to determine exposure. Let's take a look then at the other 2. So the light continues through the aperture and it reaches the sensor. And we can make the sensor more or less sensitive to light. So how that works is, if we're in a dark environment, we can make that sensor more sensitive to light because there's less light around. Or if we're in a bright environment, we don't need the sensor to be so sensitive because there's a lot of light around. Now, it's not very creative ISO, but it is one of the 3 elements that we use to determine exposure. We tend to think of ISO as the method of last resort, but more on that later. But just a little heads up, we try and keep the ISO number as low as possible. Now, it is there to be used, and if we have to lift the number up higher, then that's what we have to do. Why do we try and keep the number low? Well, as that number increases and the sensor becomes more sensitive, there is a chance that we'll introduce digital noise, and it's just what happens basically. Now cameras have got better over the years, and that digital noise is not as bad as what it used to be. So don't be frightened of it. If we do need to lift that number higher, then that's okay. So let's take a look then at the third element inside the camera that helps us determine exposure. And that would be the shutter speed. So we have a set of shutters that live over the sensor, and when we take a photograph, they open and close. So we can set the shutter speed to stay open for a long time, or it can be incredibly quick. And it just depends what we're trying to achieve. Now, clearly, if the shutter stays open for a long time, then more light is reaching the sensor. And obviously the other way around, if it's really quick, then less light will reach the sensor. But it's a lot more clever than that, because shutter speed allows us to control time. We can freeze motion, or we capture motion. We can freeze time. It's really clever, depending on what shutter speed we use. But essentially, what you need to know at the moment is it helps us to determine exposure. It's one of those three elements. Now, in a future module, we'll look at shutter speed and all the amazing things we can do with it. So they are the three elements inside your camera and where they live. Let's just take a look though at a DSLR camera, just in case you haven't got a mirrorless and you've got a DSLR. It's pretty much exactly the same. Let's take a look. So a typical DSLR camera is exactly the same with the same three elements. The only difference is it has a mirror which flips out the way when you take a photograph. And a modern mirrorless camera, of course, doesn't have a mirror. Now, other than that, they're exactly the same. Now let's take a look at the relationship then between the three elements and how they work together. And to do that, we'll take a look at the exposure triangle. So let's pop on the three elements onto the triangle. We have aperture size, ISO, and shutter speed. And all the triangle proves is that if we make a change to any of those elements, then one or the other, or both of the other two elements need to change. So if I was to change the size of the aperture, then the shutter speed would need to change, or the ISO, or both. And the same thing with the shutter speed. If I change the shutter speed, then the aperture size or the ISO, or both, would need to change just to maintain that balance. So it's a little balancing game that you play, and you will see as we go through all the various modules, you'll see how I balance those three elements to get the perfect exposure. Now let's take a look at this animation then. So I'm going to pop on the aperture size, and then the shutter speed, and then the ISO. And then down the bottom, I'll pop on an exposure meter. Now your camera has an exposure meter, but more on that later. Now the exposure meter will show us if you are underexposed or overexposed, too dark or too light. And as I say, your camera has an exposure meter in the manual mode. And we're going to take a look at that a little bit later. So let's choose a nice low ISO value of 100. I now know that that exposure is perfect. How do I know that? Because I will look at the exposure meter and the little pointer is on 0. And that's what you're kind of aiming for. When you're shooting manual, you're looking at that exposure meter and you want to see the little pointer, however it's indicated on your camera, because they are a bit different. But basically you're looking for a 0, which will sort of confirm that you've got the perfect exposure. Now let's make some changes then to the aperture size, and let's make the aperture size smaller. Now if I do that and then look at the exposure meter, it will indicate that I am now underexposed. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because I am letting less light in through the aperture size. I've selected a really small hole, if you like, in the lens, so less light is now entering the camera. So I would need to make some changes. So if I slowed the shutter speed down, it would actually balance the exposure, because I'm now letting more light in by keeping the shutter open longer. Now looking at the shutter speed that has been selected, I might decide that that's a little bit too slow. I haven't got a tripod, for instance, and the shutter is telling me it will be open for a full second, which is too long really without a tripod. So let's make some adjustments then. Let's put it somewhere reasonable, 125th of a second, and of course I will be underexposed again because I've made that change. So all I would need to do is lift up the ISO and it would return that balance to 0. So you can see it's a little balancing game of the 3 elements when you are in manual. Let's make a change then to the aperture size and just watch that little animation again. So let's make the aperture size bigger. Now clearly now I'm letting more light in, and if I didn't change the other 2 settings, then obviously I'm now going to be overexposed. So the first thing I could do then to get the exposure back to 0 is drop the ISO. And let's see where that takes me. It's still a little bit overexposed, so I'd simply increase the shutter speed. And lo and behold, we would get the perfect exposure again. So as you can see in the manual mode, it is a little dance that we do, but with balancing those 3 elements. And we use the exposure meter to ensure that we've got the perfect exposure. Now let me show you on some typical cameras, a little selection of cameras, what an exposure meter looks like when you are in the manual mode. So in this particular Fuji camera, it's on the left-hand side. This is a typical Canon camera, and it's along the bottom. And this is a Lumix camera, and it's along the bottom as well. It might look slightly different, this one, because it isn't a gauge, it's just a set of numbers, but trust me, it's exactly the same. So let me show you how the exposure meter works then on 3 different cameras, just so you get an idea of how it works, and you'll see how simple it is. In this first one then, we've got a Fuji camera, and the exposure meter is on the left-hand side, and you can see that I'm adjusting the shutter speed and the aperture size and the ISO. And all I'm watching all the time is to ensure that the exposure meter finishes on 0. And the same thing on this Canon camera, just simply adjusting the shutter speed and the aperture size and the ISO, and jumping between those 3 till I've got the exposure meter on 0. And just as importantly, I've got the settings that I want dialed in. And then lastly, on this Lumix camera, and the same thing. In this case, we don't have a gauge, but we have the numbers, so it's exactly the same. It just looks a little bit different. So that is how we balance the 3 elements in manual mode using the exposure meter. Now, when you are not in manual and you're in the semi-automatic modes, you will not have access to an exposure meter because you don't need one, because the camera is going to be helping you out. Which brings me to the end of this module, and in the next one we're going to look at those various camera modes that we can select. So I'll see you in the next module.